Welcome to this lecture about nationalism. So, as your textbook had mentioned, nationalism originated in the French Revolution, where you started to have this idea introduced that people were citizens, right? Individuals. They were not subjects, they had some rights, that they saw themselves as being part of a French nation through which popular sovereignty had to be exercised through the will of the people. And so it wasn't just divine right that was going to govern the way that politics functioned. And we not only saw this with the French Revolution, but later on, nationalism, this idea of a nation and a group of people belonging together through the nation, was present in the case of Italy with the reunification of Italy, in the case of Latin America, and then also Germany. And not only those three countries, as well as France, but we saw, especially in the 20th century, 19th century, this emergence of nationalism as a real political force that led to countries, or states as we call them in political science. States and countries are basically synonymous, that people wanting to govern themselves, seeing themselves as part of a nation, including in all of these different symbols of flags and other aspects of nationalism that became much more present in the way that politics was organized. So in the 20th century, as I had mentioned, nationalism emerged all around the world, right? In the case of the run-up to World War I, you had during colonialism and the fight against it, you had the emergence of nationalism, not just in the European context, but all across the world. And in the 21st century, as was mentioned in your textbook too, we have seen a resurgence of nationalism across Europe, as evidenced by the percent of votes won by these parties in different countries throughout Europe that are considered to be nationalist. All right, so what are we talking about when it comes to nationalism in the first place? So nationalism as an ideology, right, believes and argues that the nation is the main way that politics is organized. So this means two things: that people are divided into distinct nations, and we'll talk about what nations means in just a moment, and that the nation is the most appropriate, or maybe even the only type of political rule that should exist. Now, there are tensions within nationalism. There's a political version, there's a cultural version, there's an ethnic version. There's tensions within the idea of every group that sees itself as a nation should have the right to govern themselves, versus an expansionist version of nationalism, which would kind of argue against that and say that one nation is supreme and they have the right to rule through war, conquest, and militarism. And nationalism has been invoked both by liberals, right, on one end of kind of our ideological scale, as well as even by fascists. So there's a lot of tensions within nationalism. There's 4 core themes that I'm going to talk about in this lecture. So first of all, let's define what we mean by the nation. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, but what I want to highlight is this, right? Nations are cultural entities. They're collections of people who are bound together because they identify themselves as having shared values and traditions. What this means is often they speak the same language, or they come from the same ethnicity, they practice the same religion, they have the same history, they are from the same territorial area, right? So these are people who self-identify as a nation, right? They're bound together through some political aspirations. Nationalism in the political version is inherently a political practice, right? And these are people who want or have their own state, which we'll talk about in more detail in a few slides when I talk about self-determination, right? But these are basically people who see themselves as having some shared identity. Now, who is considered to be in the nation does vary from country to country, right? As well as there's a civic version of nationalism and there's an ethnic version or cultural version of nationalism, right? Which will influence how expansive or restrictive the boundaries of the nation are. So let me give you some examples, right? In some countries, the nation is defined by language, right? So in Germany, German speakers, they're considered to be part of a German nation. Kurds are an ethnic group. They consider themselves to be a nation. They don't have their own country though, right? They don't have their own state, but they see themselves as a nation, all Kurdish speakers. Catalans, who speak the language of Catalan, which is its own distinct language. It's actually a mix of some Spanish, some French, but it is a unique language, right? They see themselves as a Catalan nation residing in Spain. Same thing with the Basque ethnic group. The Basque also speak their own language. They live in Spain, but they see themselves as a nation, right? So here are some examples, both of nations that have their own states, like the Germans do, and then also nations who don't have their own states but want to, and these are all cases where they're defined by language, right? But we don't have the same notion of nations when it comes to English speakers, right? So obviously, English is spoken in the US, it's spoken in Australia, it's spoken in the UK, but there's no idea of like a pan-English nation, like an English-speaking nation across those countries. So it does vary from country to country. Now, religion is also sometimes, in some context, something that nations define themselves as. So in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, so the United Kingdom consists of Northern Ireland, which is technically on the island of Ireland itself. It's in the north, that's why it's called Northern Ireland. But Northern Ireland is not part of the country of Ireland. Northern Ireland is actually part of the United Kingdom, which is England, Scotland, Wales, plus Northern Ireland, right? So in Northern Ireland, what's distinctive is differences in Christianity. So you have Protestants who live in Northern Ireland who would like Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, and you have Catholics who live in Northern Ireland who don't want that. They would like Northern Ireland to become part of Ireland proper because Ireland is a Catholic country. Catholics in Northern Ireland want to be reunified, right? So that's an example of when religion is used to define the nation. Same thing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina emerged in the 1990s after Yugoslavia broke up, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had three groups who differed in terms of their religion, right? So Bosniaks are Muslim, Croats are Roman Catholic, Serbs are Eastern Orthodox Christians, right? So in the case of Northern Ireland, as well as in the case of, say, for example, Bosnia-Herzegovina, what defines the nation is the religion that you practice. Versus, Germany also has a division between Protestants and Catholics, but those two separate religious denominations are not what constitutes the German nation. The German nation is defined by the language that's spoken, right? There's also no pan-Catholic nationalism. So it really does vary from country to country who's considered part of the nation and whether it's based on language or religion or a shared history, etc. All right, so we're going to take a little bit of a detour. This was not necessarily in your textbook, but I want to give you some more context. And we'll talk about what is an ethnic group, because I feel like sometimes this is very confusing. You maybe have heard about ethno-nationalism. The book talked about an ethnic version of nationalism. So I want to define what an ethnic group is, right? This data set, which is linked to right here, called the All Minorities at Risk Project, is at the University of Maryland. I was the project coordinator for this data set when I was doing my PhD at the University of Maryland, right? And the way that we as researchers of ethnic politics define an ethnic group is as follows, right? So it's part of a country's population, not a whole, right? So ethnic groups are always kind of smaller groups. You can think of ethnic groups being embedded within nations, and because people have multiple identities, right? You all are students, plus maybe your brothers or sisters. Maybe you are employed somewhere. Everybody has multiple identities, so you can have both an ethnic identity that's going to be like a subgroup of the population, and you can have a national identity too, right? So membership is ascriptive. What this means is basically it's descent based. It's something that you inherit from your parents, right? Here are some other characteristics of this as well. And these identities are socially relevant, which means that for members of this group, of this ethnic group, being a member is important to them. It's something they practice on a regular basis, either by speaking the language of that ethnic group, by practicing the religion of that ethnic group, by practicing the traditions like celebrating different holidays, etc. Sometimes ethnicity becomes politically salient, by which I mean it becomes something that people organize in a political way. Like, for example, if you've ever heard about different ethnic political parties or ethnic organizations, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, is back in the news again with a ceasefire that happened between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is an ethnic organization. It represents Palestinians, right? So in that case, Palestinians are politically mobilized. They see themselves as a nation. They don't have their own state. That's the whole reason why there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the first place, because they want their own country and they don't have one. But we can compare that with other ethnic groups like the Coptic Christians in Egypt who are not politically mobilized. All right, so when we're talking about the differences between ethnic groups and nations, what we're saying is ethnic groups are bound together through some kind of common culture, right? They may be politically mobilized or not, right? You could have an ethnic group for whom they just want to practice their, holiday traditions, and that's about it. Nobody needs to have an ethnic party. They don't have their own state, but sometimes they might want one. And we'll talk about self-determination in just a moment. So when we talk about like an ethno-nationalist group, we're talking about an ethnic group that sees itself as a nation and wants to have its own state being synonymous with country. And we can contrast that with a nation that's bound together by common political aspirations, right? At least in like the political version of nationalism. It's inherently political. They have or they want to have their own state. And national identity oftentimes develops from an ethnic one, but it doesn't always have to. So let me give you some example of ethnic groups, and then we'll talk about what this means in the context of nations, right? So I took some screenshots here of a data set called Ethnic Power Relations, or EPR for short. This is a data set that basically identifies all of the ethnic groups around the world from 1945 until I think their data ends in 2020, maybe 2021. And what they do is they figure out which of those ethnic groups, and remember these are kind of like subgroups within a nation, which have access to political power in the executive and which don't. And the whole reason why this data set was created was because, especially in the 1990s, with the breakup of Yugoslavia and other, and there were ethnic conflicts that seemed to be happening in a lot of places around the world. Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East. So this type of data set emerged to try to understand why do we have ethnic groups that use violence to achieve their political goals. And the reason why I'm showing you all this is because I want you to see how ethnicity can vary from country to country, right? And how that changes. And so when we talk about an ethnic group, we have to really be aware of what are the important cleavages from one country to the next. So here is Algeria, a country in the Middle East and North Africa. This is obviously North Africa right here. And in Algeria, there's really just two ethnic groups. There's Arabs and there's Berbers. Now, there is an Algerian nation, right? So if we talked about the Algerian nation, we would be talking about that as like all of the people who make up the Algerian nation. But then you have subgroups within it who are going to be our ethnic groups, Arabs and Berbers. Now let's look at another state in the Middle East and North Africa. Here we have Bahrain, which is a country in the Gulf, also part of the Middle East and North Africa, right? But here, in addition to there being a Bahraini nation, you have two different ethnic groups. And what's interesting, let's go back to this slide real quick, right? Here you have Arabs, just all Arabs in general. In Bahrain, you have a distinction between Shiite Arabs, which is one sect of Islam, and Sunni Arabs, which is another sect of Islam, right? So here, the ethnic groups are separated by sects of Islam, as opposed to just being all Arab, like part of it, like a language speaking ethnic group, right? Iraq, another country in the Middle East and North Africa. And here you could see, right, there is obviously an Iraqi nation, which would be kind of like anybody who's an Iraqi citizen. But within that nation, you have different ethnic groups. And sometimes, and we'll talk about this in another slide, sometimes these ethnic groups within nations want to have their own state. So they want to be able to govern themselves. So in Iraq, again, we see the same distinction between Arab speakers. So here you have a connection between religious denomination and language. You have Turkmen who speak Turkish. You have Kurds who speak Kurdish. And then you have other ethnic groups as well. So you can see how in the same region, right, we consider these countries to all be within the Middle East and North Africa. Who is part of the nation? All of these people who live in this country, but who are the ethnic groups? That is going to vary. Sri Lanka. Now we've moved out of the Middle East or North Africa, but I wanted to show this to you to illustrate that in this case, you have a country where you have the Sri Lankan nation, right? But within the Sri Lankan nation, you have ethnic groups that in some cases vary based on the language that they speak. So the Tamils, the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Indian Tamils speak Tamil, which is a language. And the Sinhalese speak their own language, but then you also have the Muslims who are defined by the religion that they practice and not by the language that they speak. And then finally, we're going to look at Spain. So I had given already the example of how in Spain you have linguistic groups. So the Basques are considered to be an ethnic group, the Catalans, the Galicians, and then the Spanish who speak Castilian Spanish. And then in case you're wondering, right, we could talk about the U.S. as having an American nation, but these are the ethnic groups in the U.S. And I've selected this to show you that sometimes ethnic groups are based on language, sometimes they're based on religion, and sometimes they are based on race. So it really varies based on the context of the country. So when we've talked about the nation, right, we talk about the nation. The nation is comprised of various ethnic groups, but who is considered to be part of the nation may differ depending on what type of nationalism we're talking about. So there's an inclusive version, which is what's illustrated on this slide here, called civic nationalism, right, where what defines you are the beliefs that you share. So this has been the way that nationalism is defined in the US, right? It's not based on a nativist version that you have to be born in the United States and your ancestors have had to have been born in the United States, right? It's not based on language. I mean, language somewhat, but it's not like purely a linguistic form of nationalism, but it's based on the belief that if you ascribe to the values of the United States, right, the Constitution, democracy, etc., that makes you an American. It makes you part of the American nation, right? And this inclusive version of nationalism tends to be adopted by liberals and also by socialists. Now, there's also an exclusive version of nationalism, right? Where here the nation would just correspond to one of the ethnic groups within a country. It's not the case that like the nation is something that applies to all ethnic groups. That's what the civic version of nationalism would argue, but this version of nationalism, this cultural one, is an exclusive one where to be part of the nation, you have to be part of just one of the ethnic groups. Usually it's the one that's the biggest, but not always. So I have an example here of Naomi Osaka, who is half Haitian and half Japanese, but she played for Japan. And so her being part of the Japanese nation was pushing the boundaries of who can be part of that nation, because she perhaps traditionally does not look entirely like we would imagine someone from Japan to look, but yet she is part of the Japanese nation. And so who is in the borders of that nation and how it's defined can definitely change, right? This exclusive view of nationalism, where it's very much based on culture, tends to be a viewpoint that's adopted by conservatives and also by fascists. And here's some tensions within nationalism just to kind of illustrate the differences between a civic version of nationalism, which pretty much any one of those ethnic groups in a country can be part of the nation, versus an ethnocultural version of nationalism, which means only one of the groups really is the true nation of a country. Another theme of nationalism has to do with the organic community, right? That this is a community, this shared history, this shared culture, it can be language, can be religion, is something that's very deep, it's long lasting, it has a lot of emotional connection and value. And there's like 3 different versions of what we think about this organic community. So a primordialist version is one where this national identity is, we can basically say it's the closest thing to like an ethnic version, right? That you have to, it's very descent based. There's a modernist version that says that national identity is forged by socioeconomic factors. So there was a book, and this was mentioned in your textbook, by a political scientist or sociologist, Benedict Anderson, that basically talked about imagined communities, which initially sounds a little woo-woo, like what is an imagined community? But it's essentially the idea that when the print press came about and when people started to be able to read, that economic development really allowed people to start to see themselves as part of one nation. So like I don't know, for example, like an English nation or a French nation, although French nationalism came about earlier. But it's the idea that nationalism is forged by modernization. So that's one way in which we think about how this organic community develops. And then a third version called constructivism would argue that nationalism is socially constructed. And in general, in political science, as well as in other fields, we do say that identities are socially constructed. This doesn't mean that they're changed on a day-to-day basis, but people identify themselves in a particular way that can change over time. Who's in the boundaries of the group can change over time, etc., right? So national identity can be socially constructed by political events, by social events, by cultural events, by people themselves. Another core theme of nationalism has to do with the concept of self-determination. So this is the idea, and we could think about Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations following World War I. This is the idea that people organize themselves in nations, right, which sometimes corresponds to just one ethnic group, sometimes they can be much bigger, but that nations have the right to govern themselves. They have the right to do so either within their own country, which we call in political science a state. A state is basically synonymous with country. So nations have the right to govern themselves in their own country, right? When you have that, you have what's called a nation state, when the nation overlaps with the territory of a state, and that can either happen when two nations are who maybe live in different territorial boundaries are united. So, for example, if Northern Ireland were to ever unify with Ireland proper, that would be an example of the Irish nation state expanding through unification. Or sometimes you have nations that don't have their own country and want to have one through independence. Almost all of the civil wars that are fought for independence are fought by ethnic groups who see themselves as a nation but don't have their own country and want to have their own country. So like Palestinians fit in here, Tamils in Sri Lanka fit in here, Chechens in Russia, Basques in Spain, Catalans in Spain, although Catalans have never used violence, but Basques have. Especially in the 1960s and 70s, there was like a big wave of like Basque terrorism. Not all Basques supported it, but one organization in particular used it. So that's what we're talking about when of self-determination, right? The ability to govern yourselves. And sometimes nations who don't have their own state want to have their own country. Other times, nations just might want to have more political autonomy for themselves. So think about if the United States was comprised of like 50 different ethnic groups. Each ethnic group had their own state, and by this I mean like in a federal system. So let's say like Wisconsin was one ethnic group, Minnesota was another ethnic group, Illinois was a third ethnic group. So sometimes in countries you might have different like federal units being comprised of a nation, right? Like a group who sees themselves as a nation, and maybe they don't want independence, but they just might want more ability to govern themselves. And just to give you an example of some nations that have wanted to have their own country, but it did not work out. Many times it doesn't, sometimes it does, but Quebec is a province in Canada. Quebec is French speaking. So if you have been to Montreal before ever, you probably have noticed that like the language that you hear on the street is going to be French and not English. And in the mid-90s, Quebec had this referendum where people voted on whether they wanted to be their own country. So they wanted to be their own state. And you could see that this just barely failed, right? You had 50.58% voting no for Quebec to stay in Canada, 49.42% voting yes. But this would be an example of a nation, like Quebecois saw themselves as a nation, and half of them wanted to have their own state, or shortly, like a little bit less than half, and half didn't. Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, right? So I had talked about Northern Ireland, which is located here. This island here is called Great Britain. Add this and we have the United Kingdom. So there is also an independence movement in Scotland. Also referendums were, people were able to vote if they wanted to secede from the United Kingdom and just be on their own, be their own entirely independent country or not. And then same thing again, we'll go back to our example with Spain, right? So Catalonia is one of the 17 regions of Spain. Catalans obviously speak Spanish, but they also speak their own language, Catalan, which is unique, right? So if you are a Castilian Spanish speaker, you're probably not going to understand the majority of Catalan, although it does have some Spanish words and Spanish vocabulary. But Catalans also wanted to have their own country. They actually had more autonomy when Spain became a democracy in the mid-1970s. The new constitution wrote in parts of it this devolution of power. So you had 17 autonomous communities throughout Spain. And so each of those communities were kind of like their own states, like in a federal system, although it's not quite federalism. And they each have kind of their own rights, right? So like the Basques, for example, who live in, I'd have to go back a few slides, but the Basques live in like the northwest of the country, or north kind of like central. They were able to have some taxing authority versus the Catalans, who did not, but they were able to govern themselves in the context of like Spain But then they had some rights taken away from that, and you had the emergence of this Catalan independence movement in the 20 teens. All right, and our last theme of nationalism is culturalism, right? This is the idea that yes, there's a political version of nationalism called political nationalism, where the idea that the nation should be the main political organizing body and unit, and every nation should be able to govern themselves either through their own country or more autonomy within an existing country. But there's also a cultural version of nationalism that just says that the nation is a cultural entity and that culture should be preserved, right? So that is it for this lecture about nationalism. We look forward to reading your discussion post this week.